Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very last lecture of the semester. Ladies and gentlemen, we've just about made it. Good job. Congratulations. All right. So, in our last lecture, we finished up by talking about the Battle of Sharpsburg/Antietam, which I'm not going to go back into here except to say the last point, which is that this is the first major time, this Battle of Sharpsburg-Antietam, this is the first major time that the Confederates really invaded the North. And that was a sign that the war was not going in the favor of the Confederates. And it's not that the Confederates by September 17th of 1862 were ready to retire. They weren't getting completely wiped out in this. In fact, the Confederacy had been doing a very good job fighting against the overwhelming superiority in numbers and technology of the Union. It's just that the Confederates are starting to run out of supplies, and that big Union Anaconda plan, that blockade of the South is working now, and because it's working, the Confederacy is not getting supplies from its handlers in Europe. It's purchasing companies in Europe. So they're having trouble. The plan is working. So Lee invades the North, and the United States manages to fight him back, and the U.S. wins this battle. And remember that this was when the Emancipation Proclamation, was issued by Lincoln as an ultimatum to try to get the Confederacy, or at least some of the states, to surrender. Ultimately, all it does is it gets people thinking in the North that the war could be about ending slavery and not just about keeping the Southern states from rebelling and leaving the country. So this is a more emotional impact idea here, the concept that if the North wins the war, the South will lose its slaves. That is a major, major cause for a lot of Unionists to keep fighting this war and paying their taxes and joining the army and doing all those things. And so this Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued because the U.S. finally won a big battle, that's something Lincoln had been waiting for, is going to change the nature of the war. And it's right after this that you actually see some congressmen in the Capitol starting to propose the idea of a 13th Amendment to see if people would be in support or not of freeing slaves in the entire country permanently. And so that's going to be a debate that goes on for the next 3 years. But it all starts with this Emancipation Proclamation, which was designed to scare the South into leaving the country. But you remember this from the last lecture. It's also in the textbook, so we're going to move on. What happens the following year when the Union armies are fully developed now? You've got a lot of veterans in the U.S. Army now. You've got great commanders compared to when the war started that have risen through the ranks in the U.S. Army. So now the U.S. Army is going to be winning a bunch of battles, right? The tide has turned. And so it's 1863. And there's going to be three major battles here. I'm going to focus really on just one of them. But there's this one here, the Siege of New Orleans. This is where the British tried to attack back in 1815. This was, the idea was that the U.S. Navy, which had a bunch of ironclads in it now, that the U.S. had built since the Battle of Hampton Roads, proved that ironclads were the future. This battle has some ironclads and a number of normal U.S. steamships, and those ships are going to sail right into the city of New Orleans under great fire by the Confederate guns. And the U.S. troops are going to get off of the ships, and they're going to attack and finally capture the city of New Orleans. When the United States captures New Orleans, they're going to now have access to the next fortress up the Mississippi River called Vicksburg. When Vicksburg is captured by General Grant, that gives the entire Mississippi River to the United States. And I'm going to show you what that means. Right here, this is New Orleans. And the Battle of New Orleans captures New Orleans for the United States. And then the U.S. Navy, along with another armed force coming down this way by General Grant, will attack Vicksburg down here. Sorry about that. And Vicksburg is going to fall. When that is captured by the United States, then basically the entire war is now right in here. It's right here. Because these guys, Texas is now out of the battle. Louisiana is out of the battle. Arkansas is out of the battle because they're all on the wrong side of the Mississippi. They can't really do anything. And the United States is going to fortify the Mississippi River heavily. So these guys are out. They're done now. So the entire war, by the time we get to the middle of 1863, is right here. And that's going to lead, it's kind of like squeezing an egg, and eventually the yolk is going to pop out, and that yolk is going to be General Lee, and the Confederate Army, the Army of Northern Virginia, is going to try to find a way out, and they're going to rush right up this way and head up towards Pennsylvania to find a way to attack the North, because man, they have nowhere else to go. The biggest Confederate army in the South has nowhere to go, and they're going to flee into a place called Gettysburg, and we'll talk about that in a second. So this is the first two big battles of 1863 right here, New Orleans and Vicksburg, and that's what that's talking about, okay? Which brings us finally to July 1 through 3, or 1st through 3rd, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a 3-day battle, biggest battle from this point on in U.S. history, still is today when it comes to the North and South America. Obviously, the rest of our big battles have been in World War I and II. So, those are in Europe and in the Pacific. So that brings us to it. So there's just an image of U.S. steamships heading up the Mississippi River and trying to get into the back of New Orleans to attack it. Battle of New Orleans, fair enough. Crazy story if you want to read about it. And that brings us finally to the big story of the day, Gettysburg. So this is the last time, folks, that the Confederates with a large army is going to try to invade the North. They're desperate for supplies, and they're going to try to put the North on the defensive. The idea is an offensive play. General Lee of the South is going to invade the North, try to get around U.S. armies and get into the North and start attacking northern U.S. cities. And if he can do that, maybe some of the U.S. armies, let me go back to this map, if Lee can attack into the North, maybe some of the U.S. armed forces that are down here attacking the South will have to chase him to help defend the North. And here's Pennsylvania. This is where Lee is going to eventually go. Is he's going to take his army right up into Pennsylvania, and he's hoping that pressure will send U.S. troops after him and therefore allow the South some breathing room while they try to recoup and figure out how to mount a new defense. So that's where we're at, okay? Here's the Union blockade on the map right there. This is the Anaconda Plan. So that's what Lee's going to do, and that's what starts the Battle of Gettysburg, is you've got the Confederate Army invading. I'm going to play this live. Let me see if...
June 1863. 200,000 are dead, and the Civil War is barely half over. Now, General Robert E. Lee aims to move the war from Virginia and win a major battle in the North. He hopes to stoke the fire of a growing peace movement. His 75,000-man Army of Northern Virginia moves swiftly into south-central Pennsylvania. Union General George Gordon Meade and his 95,000-strong Army of the Potomac moves toward Lee. Lee concentrates his army where 10 roads converge. Gettysburg. Lee's move north will spark the largest battle in American history. It will last for 3 days. The battle starts west of Gettysburg. Union General John Buford's cavalrymen shoot at lead elements of Confederate General Henry Heath's division before falling back as Heath advances. Buford holds near Gettysburg until General John Reynolds' First Corps arrives. Infantry against infantry, fighting intense. Then, General Jubal Early's division arrives from the northeast. Despite Union reinforcements, Rhodes and Early manage to break their right flank. Yankees are fighting a losing battle on the left, too. After a savage firefight in Herbst Woods, they fall back to Seminary Ridge. Cannons and small arms blast the attacking rebels, reinforced by Dorsey Pender's division. But numbers come to bear, and the Union line collapses. Some escape via an unfinished railroad bed. Others are trapped in Gettysburg streets. The defeated Yankees reform on Cemetery Hill, where General Howard has left a brigade and an array of cannons. The Confederates probe, but do not attack. At 1 p.m., Lee bombards the Union defenses, hoping to soften them up. Meade responds, and together, they create the largest artillery barrage in the Western Hemisphere. Ultimately, Lee's bombardment fails. Nevertheless, Pickett's attack commences at 3 p.m. 12,000 men emerge from Seminary Ridge. They must cross 1 mile of open ground. Union artillery opens at long range and tears gaps in the Confederate line. Meade orders more than 20,000 reinforcements to converge upon the center. Ohio, New York, and Vermont troops position themselves upon the flank of the Confederate advance. The Confederates are moving into a great pincer of Yankees. The Southerners enter rifle range, and fewer than half cross the Emmitsburg Road. But with second and third line troops coming up, some manage to breach the Union position. A ferocious melee ensues. As tens of thousands of Union reinforcements arrive, the Confederate attackers dwindle. Lee's men don't stand a chance. Those who cross the stone wall are either killed or captured. Lee's great moment of opportunity has become his greatest defeat by far. Scarcely half of the men who made the attack returned to Seminary Ridge. In the battle's wake, Gettysburg is a place of horror. Wounded soldiers outnumber citizens by more than 12 to 1. Every home, church, and farm becomes a hospital. Most of the dead are buried near where they fell. Some are tossed into rocky chasms. Others lay exposed to the elements.
So here we are back at it, right? Which is, we've now seen how the battle started up in just north of Gettysburg, went through the town, and then finally ended where U.S. troops faced Pickett's charge and beat Pickett's charge, and the Confederate Army has to retreat to the south. Now, something does happen here where several months later, while bodies were still being buried, and I should mention that bodies from this war, the remains of soldiers on both sides, because this battle was so big throughout the fields of Gettysburg and in the forests and the Rocky Mountaintops and stuff, just this huge, like 3-mile long battle line for that 3-day period. This battle went for so long and was so fierce that bodies were still being found and buried 5 years later. Okay, so it was really bad. Well, anyway, several months after the battle happens, this guy here, President Lincoln, is going to take a train to Gettysburg. And he's going to give a memorial speech, which is his 7-year ago speech. I want to focus on it for a second because there's something about this that shows in political speech how his mind, how Lincoln is now changing from being a guy who just wants to put the country back together to being a guy that wants to use the war to actually end slavery. It's not how the war started, and that's not what Lincoln wanted to do, was to end slavery, because there was no way for him to do that legally. But now the war's gone on for so long, and Lincoln has become very powerful. in this war using his war powers, that he's thinking maybe it's that there's a chance for him to convince the Northern Congress to actually pass something called the 13th Amendment that ends slavery in all of North America. So here's his speech. I want to go through it real briefly. And it's very famous. This is the whole speech. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And that's the beginning. That's the preamble, where it looks like he's not talking about how Confederates and Union soldiers died bravely. He's going to mention that. But he starts his entire speech by saying all men are created equal. That's interesting, right? Now we go on to the memorial part. Now we are all engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And then, here he is dedicating the battlefield and the people who gave their lives. Now let's go on to the last page. We here highly resolve, he's talking to all the Union troops and stuff, right? That these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And this is where President Lincoln is talking about the fact that now the Civil War is entirely about ending slavery. That's a new move, okay? This happens as a result of the Battle of Gettysburg. Union power is definitely winning now. The Confederacy has no chance to win this war at this point, and Lincoln has become very powerful as a president. So here he is actually saying, we're going to try to end slavery. Here he is saying it, okay? And then he ends up with that famous phrase that the government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. If you want to hear Lincoln give this speech with a mannequin, you can go to Disneyland, and right there on Main Street as you walk in, there's that gallery where Lincoln gives this speech, and it's really pretty cool. Okay, so let's move into the next year, 1864, major event of the year. General Grant replaces General McClellan in the U.S. Army. Thank God for that. McClellan really needed to go. Grant was a much better general. He might not have been a good president, but he was a great general. So Grant and Lincoln are going to get a wire from the telegraph in November from General Sherman, the U.S. Army General Sherman. And General Sherman is going to have just captured Atlanta at the end of 1864. That is Atlanta, Georgia. And Sherman has this idea. What if, Sherman says, we go from Atlanta and we really show the Confederacy that they need to give up? And here's my proposal, Sherman says, by Morse code on the telegraph, right to Lincoln and Grant, which is, why don't I take my army and march through and destroy everything as we move towards Fort Walker right here in Savannah. We're going to capture Fort Walker, we'll capture Savannah, we'll march right through this whole thing, and we'll destroy every farm field, every farmhouse, all the cattle. In fact, we'll just eat the cattle, right, for our army, and we'll destroy the railroads, the roads, everything. We'll destroy everything, the cities between here and there. We'll destroy it. And basically what Sherman is proposing is to doing kind of the American Civil War version of an atomic bomb blast of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The idea is you destroy an entire region of an enemy territory to convince that enemy that there's no way for them to survive unless they finally give up. Because no states had actually surrendered, even though the Confederacy was in deep trouble at this point, and most of the Confederacy had already been occupied. So that's what Sherman proposes. Lincoln says, go ahead. And General Sherman is going to do something that will make him famous in the North and infamous in the South. And if you ever heard of Gone with the Wind, that whole story talks about how the evil Northern soldier comes down and destroys the South. And that's really about Sherman. That's what Sherman does. So Sherman is going to take his army, and they're going to destroy that swath of territory in Georgia. About a little less than a quarter of the state of Georgia is going to be wiped out, just wiped clean. And that is done as a way to convince the people of Georgia that they need to give up. And they do. Georgia will surrender finally. The whole state will surrender right after this happens. And other Confederate states will start to surrender too. So it does work. All right. This is a horrible event, and it's going to destroy a lot of people, but it does do the job. This is the first time, by the way, that the U.S. Army actually officially makes war on the citizens of an enemy territory as opposed to on just the army of the enemy. Okay, so that's total war is what that's called. So in 1865, Richmond is going to surrender. And finally, you're going to have the surrender of the commander-in-chief of the Confederate Army, a guy named Robert E. Lee. He's finally going to surrender to General Grant, and that's the end of the war. And so you have all these pictures of the soldiers at the end of the war where you've got people who are maimed but still alive. Medical care was just good enough during the Civil War, thanks to the Red Cross and Barton and all those guys, that you actually have a lot of survivors of this war. And many of these people, like this kid, he's going to live all the way towards the beginning of World War I. Like these guys, some of these people were very young when they fought in the war. And you've got battlefields like this that are going to take years to clean up, just years. So impact on future conflicts of this war, you're going to see an entire government have to be removed for the success of it. That's total war. Civilian and military targets, right? You've got Sherman's March to the Sea is going to be this idea that you could actually attack civilians as well as the military. The U.S. will continue doing that in the future, although not as much as you might think until the modern day. Sherman's March to the Sea, right? And then the Emancipation Proclamation, that's a huge part of this war. Well, how does this go? If you ever watch the movie Lincoln, it's kind of a political drama, but the movie Lincoln talks about how this goes, which is during the last year of the war, 1865, Congress just barely passes the 13th Amendment, just barely. And so here we are. I'm going to finish this up here. We've got this. This is the southern states at the end of the war, and they're all military districts now. They're occupied zones with military bases to control the people. So District 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. These regions are all controlled by U.S. armies, and basically the Northern Congress up in the United States is going to give orders to all these guys as to what they need to do to rejoin the country. So they need to change their constitutions to say that they won't rebel anymore. They need to change their constitutions to adopt the 13th Amendment. I needed to talk about what that is. So this is called the Reconstruction era. And we're only going to touch on this because when you take History 175, or if you do, you'll actually start here. You'll start with Reconstruction. So what Lincoln does after the Civil War is over is he pardons everybody. He's pretty lenient, pardons everybody except the highest ranking Confederate leaders. And those guys are going to be under house arrest for a while. And all he says is that 10% of the voting population of all the Confederate states need to swear obedience to the Constitution of the United States. And if they do that, he's going to let the state back in. That's all he wants, which is probably the most lenient end of a war in history, okay? Let's see, the 13th Amendment must be ratified by all the states. That's also important. And so that does pass in 1865. And then finally, you're going to see the 14th Amendment pass, because if you pass anti-slavery, you have to pass citizenship, because black people in the United States were not citizens yet. Even free ones were not citizens. So now, if you're going to free all the slaves, you have to make them citizens. And so that's what happens. And then finally, the right to vote to all African-American males. The 15th Amendment is going to really spark the women's movement, because what's going to happen here is black men are going to get the right to vote before white women do. So white women get really mad at the 15th Amendment, and you start to see suffragettes, right, begin to really get active during this period. Okay. I want to mention who the VP is, this guy named Johnson. Johnson was a Southerner who disagreed with leaving the country, so he felt that all Southern states were traitors, even though he himself was a Southerner. Well, when the war ends, Lincoln is shot, right? He's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. When Lincoln is shot, this guy takes over, and this guy wants to be, I don't know how to put it. Well, he wants to be lenient. I guess that says on the slide, right? To the kind of people that Lincoln did not want to be lenient to. Southern wealthy people, aristocrats, that is. And basically, if aristocrats went to the White House and talked to Johnson and gave Johnson a fee, if you will, I don't want to call it a bribe, but if they gave him a fee, he would free and also pardon leaders of the rebellion. And so 13,500 wealthy rebels are going to be freed out of U.S. prisons who were traitors to the country. And they're going to be freed, and they're going to go back home, and the rise of Southern defiance will now begin. If you've heard of groups like the KKK, if you've heard of states that were very anti-federal and did everything they can, some of them are doing it now during the COVID crisis, right, to actually do everything that they can to thwart any kind of larger authority. Well, that begins because these leaders who led the Confederacy are allowed to go back home before the dust is even settled, and they're allowed to take over positions of power because Johnson lets them. Okay, Johnson, Congress gets really mad at him, but Congress is unable to stop him. In fact, Congress impeaches Johnson, but he manages to win the vote in the Senate from getting replaced. He manages to win the Senate vote by 1 vote. And so while that limited his power, he wasn't gone. He wasn't out of office. So Johnson's going to be pretty easy on the South, which, of course, means the South is not really going to obey any new rules that the United States sets forth. You are therefore going to see the beginning of something called black codes. If African Americans are free, that doesn't mean that they have to be equal. And although that's what the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment meant, free and equal, unfortunately, what's going to happen is there's going to be an unwritten set of rules in the South that says if you're black, you are going to have one job, and that is working cotton in the fields as sharecroppers. It's almost like slavery still. And you've got the KKK, the Confederate soldiers shaking hands with the pillowcase murderer there, right? The pillowcase terrorist, right? And so the KKK is the secret enforcer of the Confederacy. I hate to say it, but Orange County, California, Huntington Beach, and Anaheim are both enclaves for the modern KKK in the West. It's insane to say that. It's weird to say that, but you can join the KKK right here in Southern California if you wish to do so, because, you know, maybe you're interested in this kind of crap. Anyway, lynchings, of course, become very commonplace because you can lynch people, and that sends a signal to other African-American families in the South that they need to basically obey the black codes, which means that they don't vote, which means that they don't argue, which means that they don't try to take jobs or run for elections for positions that white people would normally have. So that's what's going to happen. Oh, by the way, I should mention that this does not change. The black codes in the South and the power of the KKK does not change until the 1960s. Okay, that's Martin Luther King in the 1950s, and then greater change as we move into the 60s with the election of Kennedy. Okay, so the deal is, guys, is that for 100 years after the Civil War, although African Americans were now free and no longer slaves, they were treated like slaves in the South until we get to the 1960s. That's the end of our class, guys. Thanks a lot.